So it is November 8th, 2012, and we are interviewing women for Women in Wine, Remy Drabkin. And Remy is the owner and winemaker of Remy Wines. Remy, thanks first. And why don't you start by just telling me about how what's your background in the wine industry?
Thank you as well. I appreciate it. Appreciate being involved in. I grew up in the wine industry. My parents were friends with all of Oregon's first winemakers, and it was a very, very small community. The Letts and the Adelsheims and the Ponzis and Myron and Vicky and my mom worked at Nick's Italian Cafe at the time, and everybody hung out there. So, New Year's Eve and holidays, all these people came together, and it was the same group of people. And so those were the folks that I grew up around, and I quickly decided that I wanted to be a winemaker. So I think I was 6, or it could be 8, but somewhere in that range. And my dad tells this story that somebody asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said I wanted to be a winemaker. And he corrected me and let me know that I actually wanted to be a doctor, but it didn't work out for him. And then really Louisa Ponzi was headed off to college at about that time, and she was going to be a winemaker and take over her family's winery in terms of the winemaking. And I just thought that was the coolest thing, the most amazing thing. And so when she did come back and eventually did start being the winemaker at Ponzi, she gave me my first harvest job when I was 13 years old. And prior to that, we would go and help pick grapes every year, and I'd spent quite a bit of time in and around wineries at that point. But she gave me my first job, and I loved it. My mom graciously drove me to Ponzi every day, and I would work, and she'd come back in the evening and pick me up, and then school started, and so then it became after school and weekends to kind of finish out for my first crush. And I never looked back. Worked all through high school in different wineries and until now, and that was last year. So.
And so, what are some of the other wineries that you worked in? People
used to make that joke for me. I worked for Rob Stewart when he was the winemaker at Erath for 3 years, and it would be kind of harvest and summers and weekends and things of that nature. I worked at Argyle for a number of years. Rollin eventually kind of shared winemaking duties with other people, and so the kind of on-the-floor winemaker when I was there was named Willie Lunn, and he very much took me under his wing as Rob had done and as Louisa had done. And he set me up in the lab, and he started teaching me all about all the different laboratory aspects of it. And so eventually I ended up running their lab, and I ran that for about 3 years. And then I did some I worked a harvest with Tony Reinders at Domaine Serene, but then I stayed on not as a regular employee, but I would come in just specifically to do lab work for them. I wasn't a consultant for them. I just was I did contract lab work for them. And Argyle sent me to Australia, so I worked at Petaluma in Australia for a vintage, and I helped Eric Homaker the first night of his first crush sort grapes, but I wouldn't say I worked there. And then when I lived on the East Coast, I ran a little restaurant, and we made wine in the basement, so that wasn't technically working for a winery, but as the female, I did get to prepare food for all the men while they were making the wine. So I was unofficially working in another winery in a sense. And then after I started my winery, I've been a consultant winemaker for a number of other wineries as well.
Uh-huh. So, I mean, it sounds like, in a way, I think when people talk about sort of second generation winemakers, they're usually focused, it's the children of those first, 6 or so. But it really sounds like you kind of almost are a second generation in a slightly different way, because weren't you at a lot of the IPNCs early on, because your mother was
Yeah.
culinary director there, right?
Right. So I was at all of the early IPNCs. I would say I was the maybe instead of second generation, I was like the stepchild brought in after, when one parent had the child late in life or something like that.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. But yeah, I was at IPNC, as was my brother, who's now a chef, until my mom stepped down from her position. She was the culinary director from its beginning through its first 14 years. I noticed in the archive that you had set up this year, the cookbook in the wooden wine box, so my mom did that. She collaborated with somebody and put that together. It was a great year because they were taking all these recipes that these chefs were used to making for 100 people at a time, and trying to make sure that in translating them to individual or home, that somebody could make them at home, they wanted to make sure that they stayed true to what it should be. So they tested every single recipe in that box, which there are hundreds of, either Marilyn Gilbaugh or my mom made them at home on this smaller scale. So it was a great year of eating.
Sounds like you really took one for the team on that one. Huh?
Really hard. Really hard.
So you mentioned that, you were 6, 7, or 8 or so when you first started thinking about becoming a winemaker. How much did your dad fight you on the medical field thing?
My dad's always been exceptionally encouraging and supportive of everything that I've done. And now, in his retirement, he comes by and, he drives my truckloads of pumice off to the farm and unloads them and does whatever he can to help me. He's always been really fantastic. So
why don't you talk a little bit about, so you sort of become educated in the, with the different wineries. Did you also take viticulture classes? Or enology classes?
I did when I was living in France, and in some miraculous way, I was accepted before I was 18 to the Lycée Viticole. That broke rules because technically they didn't take anybody that was under 18, and especially people that were traveling from the United States, where there were only a certain number of slots available. So I took classes there, but I was totally in over my head and just accepted that early on. I went from doing an intensive Hebrew immersion in Israel to France with high school French, trying to take chemistry classes, college level chemistry classes, and it was brutal. It was brutal, but I drank a lot of fabulous wine. And there's the Nez de Vin, which is this collection of scents. And one thing I would do is I'd go to this wine shop that had it, and I think there were 100 different ones in there. And I would go, and actually, I was in the Lycée Viticole when Josh Bergstrom was at the CFPPA, which is the neighboring school. And Josh and Caroline and I all became very close friends. And so Josh and I would go down to this wine shop together, and we would test each other on the smells. And Caroline was at the Lycée Viticole de Beaune as well, and she very much, I think, she kind of in a sense saved me, because I was so overwhelmed by my sudden realization that I thought with French 5 I was solid, and I was getting schooled. It was hard, but I spent a long time. I would go to class, and then I would go back to my room, and I would be copying these notes down, and then sitting there with my Lexivin, which is like wine dictionary, French English wine dictionary, translating the notes. And ultimately I was expanding my winemaking vocabulary in French, but I wasn't getting what I was supposed to be getting out of certain classes. But some classes were more hands-on. We went out to the vineyard and we're working in the vineyard. Those were great. And the wine tasting was helpful.
That seems like that's a recurring theme, that the wine tasting wasn't bad either.
Right, no, the wine tasting was good.
So one of the things that I know about you is that you don't actually make Pinot Noir here for Remy Wines in Pinot Country.
Correct.
So why don't you explain how you arrive at what sort of your philosophy is for your winery and why you got there?
Okay. Well, it's actually very straightforward, and it was just very natural the way that it happened. So I'd been working in wine as a young adult. I moved to the East Coast for a few years, continued working in food industry related, and this tradition of everybody making their own wine, which is what these men were doing as a community in the basement of this restaurant that I mentioned previously. They did every year, and it wasn't because they didn't still go and buy really beautiful, imported bottles of Italian wine, this and that and the other, but everybody wanted to make their own wine. And so they would bring grapes over from California, and they brought in Alicante, Nebbiolo, Sangiovese, Barbera, Dolcetto, anything they could get their hands on. Literally came in like wooden fruit boxes, and everybody would carry it down to the basement. They had this hand crank destemmer, and then ferment in the basement and age the wine in old whiskey barrels. And when you wanted a bottle of wine, you would go down to the basement and you would stick a hose in the whiskey barrel, and you would fill up a bottle of wine, and you would bring it up. And I just thought that was the coolest thing, and I thought, why wouldn't everybody make their own wine? So when I came back to Oregon, I came back specifically to go work for Argyle, and I would go to work in the morning and track all the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay fermentations throughout the day and do everything that I was supposed to do. And I went home at night, and I had found somebody growing Sangiovese in Southern Oregon, and I had purchased 1 ton of fruit, and it was a big deal. Like, I found 2 other people that were willing to help buy the fruit in exchange for getting a third of the finished product. And so I made this Sangiovese I bought 20-year-old barrels from Argyle, which thankfully Willie was finally kind of circulating out. They were still beautiful. The barrels were still great, but it was like, I think you guys can get some newer stuff now. Anyways, I made this wine in these old barrels, and took care of it and loved it, and then had a bunch of friends over when it was time to bottle it up a year later, with collected glass leftovers from this winery and collected corks left over from this winery, and we ended up with a bunch of magnums because I had some leftover wine and found some magnums that nobody wanted, and but we put this wine together, and then I started giving it away to people, because all of a sudden, if you actually make wine from 1 ton of grapes, it's for your home consumption, it is a tremendous amount of wine. Even when you divvy it up into thirds, it's still a tremendous amount of wine. And so, I was giving it away to the people that I knew, which were all people in the food and wine industries. And I got great feedback, and it wasn't feedback like, oh, lovely, yes, no, you should, great try. I just kept getting this fabulous feedback, and I kept doing that. So I did that for a number of years, and just gave it away and gave it away and gave it away, and then when I started the winery, there was no reason to all of a sudden say, okay, well, now I'm going to stop making Sangiovese, and I'm going to start making Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Pinot Gris, because that's what's done here. And then I started finding things around here like this Lagrigne, which is awesome, and it's grown 16 miles from here, and it does beautifully. It's a great Willamette Valley grape, and I think it'll have continued success here. Dolcetto, which some people have been growing Dolcetto here for 20 years already, all doing really well here. The Sangiovese and the Barbera, not really specifically Willamette Valley grapes, but grapes that were wines that were important to me, and so I continued to make those as well. And and I've always just kind of been Italian at heart, and so I decided that Remy Wines would be all Italian varietals.
So when you say important to me, is it because those are some of the ones, is it Italian heritage, or they were some of the ones that you first made? Why were they important to you?
The Sangiovese was what I first made. And yeah, I mean, I'm not actually Italian, but you know, like growing up in Nix, I was brought up around this Italian food culture. The community that I lived in the East Coast was totally Italian. You heard more Italian spoken on the streets on a daily basis in this little part of the city that I lived in than you did anything else. And I just always embraced Italian culture and loved it. And yeah, so it's this like inner Italian that it doesn't really. I have a great joke, but I don't think it's appropriate to tell right now. But it relates me culturally to. Well, so I am Jewish, and there is a great joke that says the only difference between Italians and Jews is that Italians have better architecture. So it's very relatable. Italian culture is very relatable to me, and the Sangiovese was specifically important to me because it was the first thing I made, and I wanted to continue doing it. And then I love Barbaros, and yeah. But I'm not anti-Pinot. Some people think I'm anti-Pinot.
No, yeah.
I'm not.
No.
Not at all.
Well, it sounds to me like what you're trying to do is just do, I think, kind of follow your own path, and rather than, you're not kind of ruled by the idea of having to do what everyone else is doing. But it doesn't mean you're anti-Pinot.
Right.
You know?
Right.
I mean,
Absolutely.
some of your best friends are Pinot makers.
That's no doubt. And I love Pinot. And my gosh, there are a lot of people around here that make great Pinot.
Yeah.
And later on, it kind of occurred to me that it was a passive, fantastic business decision not to try to make Oregon's next best Pinot Noir, but it wasn't planned that way.
Yeah, and that's, I think, kind of what my question was, because it was, you know, I was trying to figure out how, so it sounds like it was kind of more of a following your path, passive thing than you going, I'm going to set my niche. But retrospectively, it looks like a really smart choice, and
It was great.
you don't have to disabuse people of that notion entirely.
You don't have to. But, you know, I did start 2 brands the same year at the same time. So I
Right.
started Remy Wines, which are all Italian, all single vineyard, 100% varietal. I use the Vino Law closure on them. So I did set up, even though it was natural, I did set up I did put a set of rules around what Remy Wines was going to be. And then that same vintage, somebody had some extra Pinot Blanc and they offered it to me and at a good price, and I was like, I really want that, but I can't do it because it doesn't fit into this framework that I've set up for what Remy Wines is going to be. So then I started 3 Wives at the same time so that I could bring that fruit in and have a label that was the opposite in the sense that I had no rules. And certainly I use that label to be as a playground, but also something where I can kind of, I don't want to say test, but in a sense test changes for, if I wanted to make changes for Remy Wines. So I've worked with a couple different Sangiovese vineyards. Well, I bring Sangiovese in from another vineyard simultaneously as to the vineyard that I'm working with, knowing that the home of that wine will actually be in the 3 Wives Remy's Red, and that's how I make that wine. But it still gives me a chance to see the fruit, compare the quality of the fruit, and I get to work with new people and new varietals, and there might at some point be a 3 Wives Pinot Noir.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and it sounds like there are a number of you who have adopted that kind of strategy, right? Where you have sort of like Jason has Black Cat and
Mm-hmm.
Iris, so there's the label that has more of the set rules that you guys want to follow. Like he's trying to be sort of faithful to his father's rules, and then Black Cat is kind of more where he's able to play and experiment a little bit more. And so you've got that same sort of thing going with those 2 labels.
Yeah, I agree, and I like to distinguish it. I think connecting it in that way is great, because I always fear that people will think that 3 Wives is in some way a lesser label, or like it's where I send stuff but it's not. It's just this kind of place where I get to be really creative and not adhere to anything, and then I can offer a very consistent brand with Remy Wines.
Yeah. So the Three Wives label, I have to confess to you that I was able to see the small documentary that was made, because I'm friends with some of the people who were on the committee for the film festival. So,
Excellent.
do you want to do you want to explain how that Three Wives label came about?
I will, only after I encourage everybody to go to remywines.com/Three Wives and watch Three Wives the movie, which took me a year to make and is filmed in multiple locations.
I'm just saying, we might find a place for that, in the archives if you want kind of further exposure in this thing.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I love it. It was a true labor of love. And I think it's a great movie. And I think the telling of the story in the movie is much better than I can even do it right now. But the story is that my parents were fishing in Alaska, as they do every year. My dad's been going to the same small town for a number of decades. And one year, it was actually the first year that my mom was going to go, my mom wanted to bring these other friends up with her because, she'd been hearing about this place for years. No running water, no electricity, no plumbing, things of that nature. So I think to kind of buffer the experience for her, she invited these two girlfriends along. So this town is small enough that my dad knows a lot of people in this town, and they know him, maybe not very well, but they know him because he's been going there for a long time. And so it's also, they know where he lives. And they know that he lives on a separate island than the town is in. It's only accessible by boat, and that it's a 1-bedroom, maybe 400 square foot cabin. And so here he's going to the same town year after year after year. And then one year he shows up and he has these 3 women with him. And what he didn't know, of course, is that this little rumor had gone around town that now he had 3 wives, and he brought these 3 wives. And the way that was discovered was they were sitting on the kind of shoreline in front of the cabin one day, and there was a guide boat out fishing in the bay in front of them. And it was a really beautiful day, and so the water was very calm. And as you know, sound travels over water. So, unbeknownst to the people on the boat, my parents could hear absolutely everything they were saying, as if I was saying it to you right now. And of course, they weren't really paying attention to what these guys were saying until they heard this guy say, "Oh, look, that's that guy I was telling you about." And then they exaggerate and they say, "That's the guy with 4 wives." And they loved it. And my dad loved it mostly. So then he said, "Okay, now your wife number 1, your wife number 2, your wife number 3. And it became this long-standing family joke and, family story. And,
So that's how the Three Wives label came along.
That's how the Three Wives label came along. And if you look at it, it's 3 women in a boat and they're fishing.
Okay.
So, yes.
Nice. So you talked a little bit when you were at this restaurant in California, and they're making wine, and you get to cook for them.
Yes.
I guess one of the things that we've talked, we've interviewed Susan Sokol-Blosser and Nancy Ponzi. We've actually interviewed Louisa as well about sort of that. The role of women historically and to present. We also fairly recently did an interview with Lynn Penner-Ash, sort of what it was like to be kind of really the first woman brought in. The way she puts it, I think, is the first woman hired or brought in to make wine. And there are ways in which, like Susan Sokol-Blosser talks about how even when she's running the vineyards, they win an award. She and Bill Blosser are there, and she said that she uses this kind of, it felt like a powerful phrase of, everyone's coming up. They've won an award. I think it was for the Salmon Safe program and cover crops and everything, and yet everyone's asking Bill the questions. And she just said, I felt like I was invisible as a woman. And we talk about that. Picture all these women behind the scenes, like Nancy and Susan and Diana, who's putting out newsletters and doing all this stuff. It sounds like you ran into some of that at the beginning, even as your, the kind of that women don't really make wine. And I guess being of sort of that younger generation, how much did you run into that? And I'd also like to know, I guess, what was it like to have someone like Louisa, who was already there, or Lynn, and some of the others that, as perhaps as role models. So, what did you run into that sort of, I guess, sort of blatant sexism early on much, or even still? I don't know.
Well, in that restaurant on the East Coast, yes, definitely. I mean, that was very present. But kind of my early time here, I think I just wasn't even aware of it because I wasn't looking at it from that outside perspective. What I knew was that, it was David and Diana had the winery in McMinnville, which was really cool, to be able to go to a winery like McMinnville, and that it was Dick and Nancy, and that it was Louisa that was going to be taking over. So I didn't, mentally there was no separation for me, so I certainly didn't feel any of that or take any of it with me. I'm much more aware of it now, of course, just because I'm not a kid. I used to have some great examples, but they're more they're kind of inner industry related, right? Like I learned to drive a forklift before I learned to drive a car. And not to gloat, but I've often been told that I'm the best forklift driver that anybody has ever seen. Okay. Many truckers have told me that, which makes it a true compliment. But there were many times when I would go to load a truck at a winery, and there would just be, I would just be refused. So I haven't seen it kind of from this. I haven't noticed it so much out on the outside coming in. But there are, little things. I was going to load a truck at Argyle once, and the trucker actually looked at me and said, "Where's the man?" It's like, well, I don't know. Oppressing you somewhere? That's what he's doing to me right now, apparently. But yeah, I'm sure. I know it was also fairly prevalent in France. I mean, it's just a more. Well, I don't make any broad statements, but generally speaking, it's a little bit. It's not all equalite and liberté. It's a little more sexism that's prevalent. And then I don't have anything to compare as being a winemaker for another winery. And I'm the only person here. The other day in the R bar, somebody I presented them with the wines, and the first thing out of their mouth was, "So does your husband make all the wine and own the winery?" I mean, it's out there. My experience with it, I don't feel I was ever discriminated against in hiring, but my parents' friends were all hiring me, so it's kind of a weird. Yeah, I don't know.
So, you've got Louisa that kind of serves as a bit of a role model for you. Are there other women that you've been able to sort of rely on for that, or who have been some of your mentors? I think in that way.
Well, as specifically female role models, I mean that very early start, I really looked to Louisa, and she stood out for me in that. I feel like the places that I've worked for, a number of years, all of those people have been role models, but those have been great mentors, but those have mostly been men. And I do have a great community of women that work in the wine industry that I interact with and take a lot away from that. I chair the McMinnville Downtown Wineries group. Well, that initially, it was all women representatives from these other wineries, or all of our downtown wineries, and it was a group of women that got that going. And so I do see a lot of community within women in the wine industry. A very good friend of mine whose palate I respect a great deal. Sometimes I'll take her wines. Even though she's not a winemaker, she tastes wine every day, and And I have a great respect for her, and sometimes I'll take her, 4 different blends that I've put together before I bottle and just have her blindly taste to get her feedback. So, I'm certainly not a winemaker that thinks like this, hey, here I am. I think community is great, and I think it's great that we have a community that, people feel comfortable calling each other, whether it's to ask for help or a suggestion or a piece of equipment, but it's not necessarily women specific.
Well, and it sounds like some of the men that you've talked about, I know Rollin and Rob and, Dick, Ponzi. I mean, those are some pretty great guys in terms of, just basically good people. So it's not really necessarily having to have women as role models, but I imagine those are pretty fun guys to work with in the first place.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So absolutely. You mentioned the community, because I think, early on, pretty much Irie was really the main one in McMinnville proper, right? So what's the community like in McMinnville now? How many wineries, do you know how many wineries there are that operate in McMinnville? And
there are 13 in the McMinnville Downtown Wineries group. There are a few others. I don't know exactly how many, but it's exploding right now. But that's, largely, well, there are a lot of factors. McMinnville itself is kind of renovating this end of town. There's the Northeast Gateway project that's going on right now, and the Granary District is the heart of that, and it's the beginning of it. And so the transformation of that area from kind of rundown industrial to industrial chic is inviting in all these new businesses. I'm surprised at the number of wineries that have relocated from Portland to McMinnville, quite honestly. So there's a lot of transformation going on right now. A lot of transformation going on, and I think it's interesting. It'd be interesting to see how it continues to develop. But I don't think there's kind of I don't think there would be one way to describe it because it's all so new. I think there were 3 new wineries here this year in McMinnville proper. I think 3 new wineries, and a lot of space sharing, which was great.
I kind of skipped over this piece, but when did you actually start sell? You talked about how you would make your wine and sort of give it away. When did you officially start that label or those 2 labels and start selling your wine?
2006. And I sold futures of my 2006 vintage that first Thanksgiving weekend, which was a fabulous suggestion that somebody made to me, and I was thrilled. I mean, I remember I sold futures of I think it was all Barbera and Sangiovese, and I just stood there and gave barrel samples all day long, and people had a minimum 6-bottle order. And I remember the first person that ordered 6 bottles of Barbera, and I was basically in tears. I was like, oh my God, I sold wine. Thank God I might be able to repay my business loans one day. But no, it was really exciting. So I started making wine commercially in 2006, and then right away started selling it. I no longer offer futures, but I do have a fantastic wine club, as you know.
Are there any, well, it seems like you've made some pretty good decisions. Like you said, we talked about sort of the passive one to kind of focus on Italian wines. Is there anything really sort of striking that you would do differently if you had to do it over again?
Maybe just at times having a stronger voice in terms of what I wanted or needed from a scenario. I worked in a number of shared space facilities for a while, and often found myself frustrated by what wasn't, what I wasn't asking for, basically, as kind of the renter in those situations. But, I try not to regret any decisions. Things have been going, wonderfully. I think I've made a couple really strong decisions recently that have just had such an incredible effect on my business that it's unbelievable. Where I finally kind of let go of the feeling that like I'm just constantly struggling and fighting to keep everything going. I hired Annika Schilling, who used to be Annika Allen. Her dad taught math at Linfield for many years. She's also a Linfield graduate. And she takes care of my operations now, so all of my reporting and kind of, data entry and stuff that takes just a ton of time. One of the first things she did was she revised my winery application, or I reapplied for a new application because I wanted to expand into the space that we're sitting in right now. But you can't just tack on space, you actually have to redo the entire application, which is very time consuming. She did that, which allowed me to open this place, to open the R Bar. I mean, I would have been, maybe I would have been able to get all that together and get ready for harvest and then use this as harvest space. But she's just propelled me in making things happen, and relieved my stress load. So then I can, focus more on what I'm supposed to be doing, which is making wine. And then I opened the R Bar, which has been great. I mean, it's the other, fun thing. We've got art all around in here right now because we had an art opening. We have a new artist coming in beginning of December, and I think that this has been a good community space, and it's been great. So no regrets, just better and better decisions.
Cool. So do you have any advice, I guess maybe especially for maybe women who want to get into the wine industry, any particular advice that you would?
When people who aren't in the wine industry have previously asked me for advice about getting into the wine industry, I've suggested they don't do it. Not because I don't love it, but because it's really hard to make a career in the wine industry. You see people that do it that are very successful, but most harvest positions, tasting room positions, general cellar positions, those there's a kind of a very low ceiling on what you can kind of make in terms of turning it into a career. And then there's only so many winemaking positions, and there's only so many assistant winemaking positions. But I don't want to dissuade people's romantic notions of the wine industry either. No. No. I mean, just know that you're going to work hard and be dirty a lot and get wet, and your hands are going to be brown a lot of the year, and you just have to be okay with that. And but the flip side is you get a great community, and you do have the opportunity to try great wines and great food, and you get to meet a lot of fabulous people, and I mean it's a great industry to work in. So I don't know. Don't leave your professorship to the.
I hear from a lot of people that the best way to become a winemaker is to be independently wealthy through some other industry.
Yes, and then slowly get rid of your wealth.
That's right.
Throwing it away.
Yeah.
No, it's a cool it's a cool industry, and it is growing, and there are a lot of great programs. I mean, I think that's one thing that I would say is, even though I can't say, well, yeah, I got my, winemaking degree at Davis or something like that, is that I would really encourage that there's balance between making sure you know what's going on the scientific side of it, and then also balancing that out with getting your kind of real life experience in the cellar or whatnot. The sales end is different because that's it's a necessary part of the wine industry, and I think it's where a lot of women are in the wine industry, but that has its own set of rules, and they might be wine specific, but at the end of the day, it's also part of this other, it's sales. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, plus you got your degree from Linfield, right? So I mean, that prepared you just tremendously.
That's right. And actually, that was very much because of Roland, because I started my degree at Linfield, and then 10 years later, went back and finished my degree at Linfield. But Rollin said to me, he said, you are going to just limit out here. He's like, you're close. And I had, I was making good money. I loved my job. I had a great schedule. I had some kind of light management position. I felt really good, and I was very young, and so I felt really good about that. But he was like, look, this feels great right now, but you're going to want to keep going, and if you don't go back and get your degree, you're never going to do that. And it was, fantastic advice. So my degree in social and behavioral science has helped me tremendously with the with the winemaking. But it made me feel it gave me so much confidence to have done that, and I loved the experience. And then yes, I did graduate from Linfield just a few short years ago.
Just a few short years ago. Well, I think that's all I have. Are there any other? I think I've covered the questions. Or anyone else?
I would ask, what's next? What's next for Remy Wines? What's next for you? And where do you think the wine industry is going?
Well, I can't speak for the industry as a whole, but what I would say is that, Oregon as a brand, we're still moving ourselves forward. There's still plenty of people in the States, let alone outside of the States, that don't realize that we are producing quality wines here. So I think that we as a community need to continue to work together to kind of promote brand Oregon. And something that I've always felt about businesses that are in communities like this is that we recognize that we are not each other's competitors. That what we want to do is, I don't want to try to beat. I'm not trying to outsell anybody around here. It's not about that. It's about what's the best way that all of us can be successful together. So I think that that's very important that we hold on to that as we move forward. Certainly that's always been a huge part of the Oregon wine industry. For me, Nebbiolo is on the horizon. Just a couple of years from now, it's in barrel now. First vintage of Nebbiolo for Remy Wines. So that's pretty exciting. And I continue to keep things, to keep introducing new things, but not so that I have an ever expanding brand, but that there are exciting things coming out of the winery. I do a 3-year barrel aged port style wine every year, but also what I've been doing since 2006 is keeping one barrel that is intended for a 10-year barrel aging. So, that will be in the future. 4 more years, then I'll have that to offer, and I continue to do new things. There's a lot of aspects to the winery that keep it very fun and very interesting. The Nebbiolo is one thing. It'll be a new offering in 2 years, which is great, and I loved making it, and have wanted to make it for some time. But then that also means that I get to go in and work on the label design part of that, which personally is very fulfilling. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to do another art opening in here, and we're going to, just continue to do new fun things and try to continue to make Remy Wines kind of a community space. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I don't know. Make good wine. just really try to keep making good wine. That's my main goal, always. It's not to screw it up.
Just not to screw it up.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.